Hi, this is Matt Baker. Welcome to episode 4 in my series on Who Was Jesus Really? So far, we've looked at 3 possibilities. The first was that he was the secret child of Herod Antipater, Herod the Great's firstborn son, as well as a descendant of the Hasmoneans. The second being that he was the prophet known as the Egyptian, who, according to Josephus, led an attack on Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives in 54 CE. And finally, that he was the well-known Jewish revolutionary and founder of the Zealots, Judas of Galilee. Now, once again, it's important for me to stress that none of these hypotheses are taken very seriously by secular scholars. The reason I chose to share them with you is because they're simply a fun way to teach you about some of the historical context surrounding Jesus, such as who the Judean royal family was, what the general timeline of events was, and why the works of Josephus are so important. Well, today we're going to continue this process by looking at yet another hypothesis, this time one that is more well known, even though it's still considered to be very fringe by mainstream scholarship. It's called the Flavian hypothesis, and it's mostly based on the book Caesar's Messiah by Joseph Atwill, published in 2005. Basically, the idea is that the Romans invented Christianity shortly after they destroyed Jerusalem in 70 CE, and that the character of Jesus is really just a disguise for Emperor Titus, who was the one who defeated the Jews. But first, I want to point out that while it's difficult to know exactly who Jesus was, it's quite easy to find information about your own ancestors, thanks to today's sponsor, MyHeritage. If you input just 7 names into their easy-to-use family tree builder, your own name, your parents' names, and your grandparents' names, MyHeritage will do the rest. Their website will automatically compare your information to its 34 billion records, most of which are not available via Google. It will then automatically provide you with discovery links. All you have to do is click on one of those discovery links and then decide whether or not their suggested matches look promising. If they do, you can often triple the size of your tree within seconds. Personally, I find using MyHeritage to be a really fun way to learn more about my ancestors. Seeing their names written on actual documents like this one really makes history come alive. What you're looking at here is a page from the very first census of Canada ever taken. And this is my great-great-grandfather, Jacob Baker, my great-great-grandmother, Lucy Baker, and my great-grandfather, Gabriel Baker, who was only 9 years old at the time. So if you want to find information like this about your own family, I'd suggest that you sign up for a 14-day free trial of MyHeritage right now by clicking the link in the description or pinned comment. As a Useful Charts viewer, you will also get 50% off a premium membership. Okay, back to the Flavian hypothesis. Let me start by reminding you who the Roman emperors were during the lifetime of Jesus, as well as during the first several decades of Christianity. To do this, I'll use our Roman emperors family tree chart, which, of course, is available from usefulcharts.com. When Jesus was born, the Roman Empire was still in its infancy, and therefore its very first emperor, Augustus Caesar, was still in charge. However, around the time that Jesus would have been a teenager, Augustus died and was succeeded by his adopted son, Tiberius. It was therefore Tiberius who was the emperor during the entire length of Jesus' ministry, as well as at the time of the crucifixion. Tiberius was then followed by 3 of his relatives, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. These 3 served during the days of the earliest apostles, such as Peter and Paul. But then in the year 68, which is when Nero died, this original line of emperors, known as the Julio-Claudians, came to an end. What followed was a brief civil war in 69, known as the Year of the 4 Emperors, which ended when Vespasian became emperor. At this point, a new imperial dynasty was formed, known as the Flavians. Now, interestingly, when Vespasian was declared emperor, he was actually in Judea, leading the Roman armies in the First Jewish-Roman War. So he had to quickly depart for Rome and leave his son Titus in charge of finishing the war against the Jews, which Titus did, destroying Jerusalem in 70 CE. 9 years later, when Vespasian died, it was Titus who became the next emperor. So whether or not the Flavian hypothesis is true, it is an undisputed fact that both Vespasian and Titus have a strong connection to Judea. On top of this, according to most mainstream scholars, it was also during the reigns of Vespasian and Titus that the earliest of the 4 canonical Gospels, Mark, was likely written. So that puts the Flavians in charge at the exact moment when the story of Jesus was being recorded for the very first time. And here's the thing. In light of what we know about Judean history at the time, the story of Jesus is kind of strange. As we've seen in the last 2 episodes, Judea was a hotbed of anti-Roman activity. Because the monotheistic religion of Judaism was incompatible with the polytheism of the empire, there were constant revolts and rebellions, with lots of would-be Jewish heroes repeatedly trying to overthrow the Romans and regain Judean independence. But although there are hints throughout the Gospel that Jesus and his disciples had links to rebel groups, the Gospels are, for the most part, very pro-Roman and pro-pacifism. For example, Jesus is quoted as saying things like, "Render unto Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Do not resist evil. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other cheek also. And even love your enemies. Pray for those who persecute you." On top of this, Roman soldiers and tax collectors for the Romans are often portrayed in a positive light. In Luke 7, Jesus heals the servant of a Roman centurion and then says of the soldier, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." Later, in Acts, which was written by the same author, another Roman centurion named Cornelius becomes one of the first Gentile converts to Christianity. As for tax collectors, there's the story of Zacchaeus, who is portrayed as being righteous because he climbs a tree to see Jesus, and Levi, aka Matthew, who becomes one of the 12 disciples. In contrast, the Jewish leaders are consistently portrayed as being the bad guys. So, ironically, after decades of anti-Roman activity in Judea, we suddenly get a new movement that is quite openly pro-Roman, or at least neutral towards the Romans, being focused on spiritual matters rather than political ones. So, even if the Flavians didn't invent Christianity, they definitely would have seen it as being a positive development, especially compared to the previous Jewish movements, which had been so troublesome. This new Christian form of Judaism didn't even require its followers to adhere to all those strange Jewish customs like circumcision and avoiding pork. In other words, in the very Hellenistic world of the Roman Empire, Christianity fit in much better than Judaism. So beyond the fact that the reigns of the Flavians perfectly overlap with the writing of the Gospels, and that the Gospels are quite favorable towards Rome, what evidence is there that the Flavians might actually have been involved in creating this new religion? Well, first of all, according to tradition, it is thought that several members of the Flavian family might have been Christians. Most important is Titus's niece Domitilla, who is considered a saint by both the Catholic and Greek Orthodox churches. She's associated with the catacombs of Domitilla, which include some of the earliest images we have of Jesus. She was married to her second cousin Clemens, who Atwill claims was the same person as Clement of Rome, the fourth or perhaps even the second pope, as well as the author of the first epistle of Clement. However, Atwill's main evidence for the Flavians being the creators of Christianity are the parallels that he sees between several stories about Jesus recorded in the Gospels and certain military battles fought by Titus recorded in Josephus. He even goes as far as to claim that Jesus is simply Titus in disguise, created in order to trick the Jews into worshiping Titus as a god. For example, there's the story of Jesus calling the first disciples on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. There he says to Peter and Andrew, "Follow me, and I will make you fishers of men." Atwill argues that this is an allusion to a famous battle fought at the exact same location during the early phase of the Jewish-Roman War. In Book 3, Chapter 10 of the Jewish War, Josephus describes a scene where Titus and his soldiers end up stabbing the Jewish rebels in the water with long spears, as if they were literally fishing for men. Then there's the story that takes place near the city of Gadara, in which Jesus casts out a legion of demons from a madman, and then allows them to enter a herd of pigs, at which point they race off the side of a cliff and are drowned. Once again, there was a battle that occurred at this same spot during the Jewish-Roman War. In Book 4, Chapter 7 of the Jewish War, Josephus describes that the Jewish rebels rushed at the Roman soldiers like the wildest of wild beasts, only to then rush to their own deaths. Atwill goes on to show many other parallels in his book, but I think you get the point. Oh, and did I mention that Josephus himself was a Flavian too? Well, he was, kind of. Supposedly, Josephus predicted that Vespasian would become emperor, and therefore, when he did, Vespasian took him into his household and sort of adopted him, allowing him to use the name Flavius. The idea here is that because Josephus was connected to the Flavians, he was able to make sure his account and the gospel account lined up perfectly. The best example of the Gospels and Josephus lining up perfectly is Jesus' prophecy of Jerusalem's destruction. In Mark 13, verse 1, Jesus says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. All will be thrown down." And then in verse 30, he says, "Truly I tell you, this generation will not pass away until all these things have taken place." Scholars' best guess as to when Jesus said this is 30 CE, right before he died. And according to Josephus, the temple was destroyed in 70 CE. That's exactly 40 years, which also happens to be what Jewish literature at the time considered to be the average length of one generation. In other words, Jesus was spot on. So either Jesus did in fact prophesy things correctly, or whoever wrote the Gospels made it seem as if he did. Atwill, of course, argues for the latter. His argument is that Titus saw himself as the Jewish Messiah and the culmination of Jewish history. He points out that in the early parts of the Gospel story, there are clear parallels to the overall narrative of the Hebrew Bible, parallels that any Jew at the time would have seen. First, a guy named Joseph goes down to Egypt. Next, there is a massacre of young children. Then there's a return to God's promised land, where there is a symbolic cleansing with water. Finally, there is a period of either 40 years or 40 days in the wilderness. So yeah, the idea is that the next chapter of Jewish history will be like the first, except this time, their new future will involve being ruled by the glorious Roman emperors, who will be their new gods, especially Titus, who was the son of the father, Vespasian. Now, the last piece of evidence for this theory comes not from Atwill, but from the authors of the 2018 book, Creating Christ. This newer book claims to provide actual archaeological evidence for the Flavian hypothesis. Their argument mostly rests on this symbol here, seen on the back of a coin with Vespasian's image. According to the authors, this exact symbol was used by early Christians, as demonstrated by these carvings found in Christian catacombs, as well as these rings, some of which have text which proves that they were indeed used by Christians. We also know that this symbol is associated with the Latin phrase vestina lente, which means make haste slowly, which was the motto of Emperor Titus. Okay, so all of this seems, on the surface, at least very interesting. But there are some major problems with the hypothesis. The biggest one in my mind is the fact that there was simply no need for the Flavian emperors to go through all the trouble of creating a new religion for the Jews when they had already defeated them militarily. And I mean, like, really defeated them. Jerusalem was totally destroyed in 70 CE. So by the time Titus became emperor in 79, the Jews were a distant memory for him. Plus, he had other stuff to worry about. Just 2 months into his reign, Mount Vesuvius erupted, destroying the city of Pompeii. And then the following year, fire broke out in Rome, destroying several important buildings. Plus, he had to finish the massive Colosseum project that his father had started. So I doubt he had much time to care about whether or not the Jews thought of him as their Messiah. Plus, there's the fact that the Gospels don't seem anywhere near coordinated enough to have been a government-sponsored project backed by the emperors. Sure, Matthew and Luke definitely copied Mark, but what about the dozens of other Gospels that didn't make it into the canon? And the fact that the Greek used in the Gospels is very different from the Greek used by Josephus. But here's the thing. While many of the theories we've been discussing come across as trying to hammer a square peg into a round hole, they often do end up conveying some good ideas, if you look at the general points rather than the specifics. For example, last time I mentioned that even if it's a stretch to say that Judas of Galilee was the exact same person as Jesus, the general idea of some first-century Jewish teacher slowly morphing into the character we all know as Jesus is in fact quite plausible. Well, the same goes for the Flavian hypothesis. Even if the Flavian emperors didn't go out of their way to intentionally create Christianity, the events in Judea that they were involved with certainly did play a role. You see, after the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, all hope of creating an independent Jewish state was pretty much lost. Therefore, Jewish groups that were more pacifist and willing to live alongside the Romans, like Christianity, suddenly became more dominant. Christianity had the added bonus of making it easy for Gentiles to join. So it was perhaps no surprise that the Christian version of Judaism eventually eclipsed all the other versions. So the bottom line is, the Roman Empire under the Flavians was a much better environment for Christianity to flourish in than was the Roman Empire under the Julio-Claudians. Now, before I go, I do want to mention that there are several other theories related to the Flavian hypothesis that I won't be covering because they're so similar. For example, there's this book that claims that the Jesus story was actually a retelling of Julius Caesar's life, and this one that claims that the wealthy Piso family created Christianity. However, the most interesting book related to this theory is perhaps this one by Russian author Kirill Yeskov. In English, it's called The Gospel of Aphrenius, and it includes a short novel about a Roman soldier named Aphrenius, who is the head of Pontius Pilate's secret service. In this fictional world, Aphrenius manages to manipulate Jesus and his disciples and turn their movement into one that serves the needs of Rome. As I mentioned last time, if you know of any other theories about Jesus, do let me know in the comments, as I'm currently brainstorming ideas for future episodes. And don't forget to sign up for a 14-day free trial with MyHeritage. Thanks for watching.